A phone call interrupted the bourbon. 5:25 in the afternoon, April 12, 1945. House Speaker Sam Rayburn and Harry Truman had been unwinding after a long day when Steve Early's voice came through the receiver, shaking with something Truman couldn't quite identify. "Come to the White House immediately, and come through the main Pennsylvania Avenue entrance." "What's happened?" Truman asked. Early wouldn't say, "Just come now." 30 minutes later, Eleanor Roosevelt placed her hand on Truman's shoulder in her White House study. 5 words changed everything. "Harry, the president is dead." Franklin Roosevelt was gone. The man who'd guided America through depression and war for 12 years had died in Georgia, and Harry Truman, vice president for exactly 82 days, now controlled the most powerful nation on earth in the middle of the largest war in human history. Truman's first words revealed how unprepared he was. "Is there anything I can do for you?" Eleanor Roosevelt's response would echo in his mind for months. "Is there anything we can do for you? You're the one in trouble now." She was right. Truman was in trouble he couldn't have imagined. 82 days as vice president, 2 meetings with Roosevelt, both ceremonial and brief. No briefings on military strategy, no discussions of diplomatic agreements, no knowledge of secret programs consuming billions of dollars. Roosevelt had kept him completely in the dark. The next morning's cabinet meeting made the scale of the problem clear. Truman sat at the head of the table, surrounded by Roosevelt's inner circle men who'd shaped the New Deal, planned the Normandy invasion, sat across from Stalin at Yalta. They looked at Harry Truman and saw a former haberdasher from Missouri who'd gotten the job because he wasn't controversial enough to alienate any faction of the Democratic Party. A placeholder, an accident. Now, their boss, Secretary of State Edward Stettinius, began briefing on diplomatic matters. Truman recognized immediately what was happening. Stettinius was withholding information, mentioning agreements with the Soviets without explaining what Roosevelt had actually promised Stalin. Then came day 13. Secretary of War Henry Stimson requested an urgent private meeting. Truman expected news about Europe or the planned invasion of Japan. Instead, Stimson revealed a secret that stunned him. For 3 years, America had been building an atomic bomb. $2 billion, 130,000 workers, secret cities in Tennessee and Washington. The most powerful weapon in human history, nearly ready for testing. Roosevelt had never mentioned it. Stimson explained the compartmentalization. Only a handful of people knew about the Manhattan Project to prevent leaks. But the result? Truman had been president for 12 days before learning America was about to possess city-destroying power. That moment crystallized everything. Truman wasn't just uninformed about strategy or diplomacy. He'd inherited a government running massive programs without his knowledge, programs that could reshape human civilization. And the people who knew about these programs were Roosevelt's loyalists with their own agendas, their own relationships with foreign leaders, their own vision of how the war should end. They weren't working for the President of the United States. They were working to preserve Roosevelt's legacy. Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau had plans for post-war Germany that Roosevelt had approved. He expected Truman to rubber-stamp them without question. Commerce Secretary Henry Wallace was worse. Roosevelt's vice president from 41 to 45, replaced by Truman at the convention. Wallace believed the presidency should have been his. He made no secret of his contempt and continued pushing foreign policy ideas that directly contradicted Truman's direction. Attorney General Francis Biddle treated Truman like a temporary inconvenience. In office since 1941, he saw himself as guardian of Roosevelt's domestic programs and barely acknowledged Truman's authority in meetings. But the most dangerous was Stettinius, Roosevelt's personal choice for handling relations with Stalin and Churchill. He'd attended Yalta, where the Big Three had carved up the post-war world. Truman asked directly what had Roosevelt agreed to at Yalta. Vague answers about spheres of influence and democratic elections in Eastern Europe. Truman pressed for specifics. Poland, Germany. Soviet entry into the war against Japan. What exactly had been promised? Stettinius claimed he didn't remember details. An obvious lie. He'd spent 3 weeks at Yalta taking notes. He remembered everything. He just didn't want to tell Truman because he knew what Truman's reaction would be. When Truman finally obtained the actual Yalta documents, he understood the evasion. Roosevelt had made massive concessions to Stalin in exchange for Soviet promises Stalin never intended to keep. Poland would have free and unfettered elections, but also a government friendly to the Soviet Union. Stalin interpreted this as permission to install a communist dictatorship. Roosevelt's people had let him. The Soviet Union would receive massive territorial gains in the Far East. After defeating Japan, the Kuril Islands, southern Sakhalin, control over key Chinese ports. Roosevelt was giving away Chinese territory without consulting China. Most shocking. Roosevelt had agreed to Red Army occupation of Eastern Europe with no concrete plans for withdrawal. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, all under Soviet military control, with no timeline for liberation. Roosevelt had sold out Eastern Europe to keep Stalin happy. His cabinet knew about these deals and was now trying to ensure Truman honored them, even as they guaranteed Soviet domination of half the continent. Truman decided Roosevelt's inner circle had to go. He called his advisors. He was cleaning house. New people loyal to him, not to Roosevelt's memory. The advisors warned him. Politically dangerous. Roosevelt was beloved. His cabinet members were seen as war heroes. Fire them all at once, and the press would accuse him of betraying Roosevelt's legacy. Democrats in Congress would revolt. The public would see petty revenge. Truman didn't care. I'm the president now. These men need to understand they work for me or they work for nobody. July 1945, replaced as Secretary of State with James Berners, a tough South Carolina politician Truman trusted completely. No Roosevelt loyalty, no illusions about Stalin. A harder line against Soviet expansion. Henry Morgenthau resigned under pressure in July 45. Fred Vinson replaced him, a Kentucky congressman who understood post-war Germany needed rebuilding, not destruction. Morgenthau's plan would have created an agricultural wasteland. Vinson knew a strong Germany was necessary to counterbalance Soviet power. Francis Biddle fired in June 45. Tom Clark took over a Texan focused on domestic security rather than preserving New Deal programs. Henry Wallace lasted until September 46 before Truman finally fired him for publicly attacking Truman's foreign policy. By late 1946, Roosevelt's entire inner circle was gone. Truman had built a new cabinet loyal to him and sharing his hard line against Soviet expansion. The political reaction matched predictions exactly. Liberal Democrats screamed betrayal of Roosevelt's legacy. Press articles questioned Truman's competence. Roosevelt loyalists gave interviews claiming Truman was destroying everything FDR built. Wallace toured the country attacking Truman's foreign policy, too aggressive toward the Soviets. Roosevelt would have cooperated with Stalin. His speeches drew massive crowds of liberals who believed Roosevelt's vision of post-war cooperation was still achievable. Even Eleanor Roosevelt began subtle criticism. Newspaper columns suggesting her husband would have handled Stalin differently. Implications that Truman was abandoning Roosevelt's dream of UN-maintained world peace. Approval ratings collapsed. November 46 Gallup poll, 32% approval. Democrats lost Congress in the midterms. Political insiders quietly discussed whether Truman should even run in 48. Truman ignored it all, continued replacing Roosevelt's people. He wasn't interested in popularity. He was interested in confronting the reality of Soviet aggression that Roosevelt had ignored or enabled. Wallace had argued Stalin would allow free elections in Eastern Europe if America showed more trust. Stalin installed communist dictatorships in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany. No elections. only occupation and repression. Statinius had insisted Stalin would honor Yalta agreements about democratic Poland. Stalin installed a puppet government and executed Polish resistance leaders who'd fought the Nazis. Poland remained under Soviet control until '89. Morgenthau had wanted to prevent German industrial rebuilding. Truman's rejection of the Morgenthau Plan led to the German economic miracle of the '50s. Prosperous, democratic West Germany became NATO's cornerstone and the main counter to Soviet power. The Marshall Plan, designed by Truman's new Secretary of State George Marshall in '47, rebuilt Western Europe and prevented communist takeovers in France and Italy. If Truman had listened to Roosevelt's cabinet about punishing Germany and cooperating with Stalin, Western Europe would have been economically devastated and vulnerable to Soviet influence. Truman's hard line led to the Truman Doctrine, the Berlin Airlift, NATO. These policies contained Soviet power and prevented World War III. Roosevelt's vision of cooperation would have meant Soviet domination of all Europe. Why did Truman fire everyone who worked closely with Roosevelt? Because they remained loyal to a dead president's vision that didn't match reality. Roosevelt believed he could charm Stalin into democratic behavior. He'd given massive Yalta concessions, hoping Stalin would reciprocate. Stalin had no intention of reciprocating. He saw concessions as weakness and exploited American naivety to seize as much territory as possible. By the time Truman took office, the Red Army occupied half of Europe, and Stalin was consolidating communist control over populations that wanted freedom. Roosevelt's cabinet couldn't accept that their beloved president had made catastrophic mistakes. They wanted to preserve his legacy by continuing cooperation with Stalin, even as Stalin violated every agreement he'd made. Truman understood what Roosevelt's people couldn't see. The world had changed. The Soviets weren't allies anymore. They were rivals in an ideological struggle that would define the second half of the century. America needed leaders who understood that reality, not dreamers still believing in Roosevelt's vision of post-war harmony. Firing Roosevelt's cabinet was politically risky but strategically necessary. Truman needed people who would help build containment policy against Soviet expansion, not people who would continue appeasing Stalin in Roosevelt's name. The first task of any new leader ensure everyone rows in the same direction. Roosevelt's cabinet was still rowing toward cooperation with the Soviet Union. Truman needed them rowing toward containing Soviet aggression. When the previous leadership's vision no longer matches reality, hard choices become necessary. Truman could have kept Roosevelt's cabinet to avoid criticism. Instead, he fired them and built his own team, knowing it would hurt him politically. History vindicated that decision. The Truman Doctrine and NATO prevented Soviet domination of Western Europe. The Marshall Plan rebuilt democratic societies that became America's strongest allies. The Berlin Airlift showed Soviets that America would stand firm. None of that would have been possible with Roosevelt's cabinet. Those men would have continued pursuing Roosevelt's failed cooperation policy. Truman understood that loyalty to a dead president's mistakes was worse than the political risk of cleaning house. That's why Truman fired everyone who worked closely with Roosevelt. Not from spite or jealousy, but because America needed leaders who understood the world as it actually was, not as Franklin Roosevelt had hoped it would be. And Truman was willing to take the political hit to make sure that happened.